lesson to look at Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation. So this is the second of Bowlby's theory that is named on the AQA specification. And if we have a look here, it's the second to last bullet points, and it actually states Bowlby's theory of maternal deprivation, and that's what we're going to focus on today. We're also going to have a little look at the effects of institutionalisation slightly through this. We're not going to be looking at the remaining orphan studies today. We'll probably get onto that next week. So we're mainly going to focus on this theory and the study that goes with this theory today. So first of all, maternal being the mother or the caregiver, and deprivation translates to having something and having lost it. And what's interesting here is that in some of the people studied for Bowlby's theory, they are people who are actually privated, so they haven't actually had an attachment at all. But in most cases, they are deprived. So deprivation is when an attachment is broken. And if you remember that he stated in his original theory that the critical period, the sensitive period, is the first 2 to 2.5 years. And he suggests, first of all, so the key thing that you need to take from this is he suggests that if there's any disruption of the bonds within the critical period, the first 2 years, 2.5 years, that can have very serious consequences. And those consequences will be in several areas of the child's life. And first of all, there will be consequences on the intellectual development. So for a minute, just think about what those consequences might be. So it might be that they may not progress as quickly at school, they may not read as fast, they, again, in terms of the national curriculum, they would probably be slightly delayed in terms of how fast they would progress sort of through the levels. Emotional development, they might be quite immature, and they also might be a lot more kind of aggressive and selfish. So this is a hypothesis, and remember, a hypothesis is something that is a testable statement, so it's not a fact. But Bowlby states that breaking the maternal bond with the child during the critical period is likely to have serious effects on intellectual, social and emotional development. And we're going to have a look at what some of those are, and you need to be able to identify what some of those effects are, and clearly make sure that you know whether it's intellectual, social or so on. And then the next bit at the bottom is the bit where it says that another key thing here is that a lot of these negative effects are permanent and irreversible. And that's kind of what the focus of this lesson and this part of the course is about, really. And really it's about is that correct, that these effects are permanent and are irreversible? Because if they're irreversible, then we go back to the importance of having an attachment and the importance of a mother or caregiver. And really what we're saying is if there isn't one, then the child is going to have some irreversible damage. So that's kind of to highlight how important an attachment is. Okay, so in order to demonstrate this, Bowlby examined the links between a condition called affectional psychopathy and maternal deprivation through this study. Now, I would like you to look at this study, and we're going to spend quite a while looking at this because you will need it in the second year of the course. And what I found is when students come to do this in the second year, they can't remember it. But it is really important that you do remember this study, and it's the reason that I hope you remember it is because the name of it is quite inflammatory. It's called Bowlby's 44 Thieves study, and that's something that we're going to talk about, particularly for year 2 when we look at issues and debate, to talk about the inflammatory nature of that title of the study and what that might actually mean. I've always remembered this just because of the name of the study. So basically, Bowlby looked at 44 children. As you can see, if we have a look at the actual procedure, he used a sample of 44 teenage delinquents, is who he describes them as. Now, in my mind, they are just 44 children, basically, probably aged up to about 14, 15. And he wanted to have a look if there was any link between what he named affectionless psychopathy, which I'll talk about in a minute, and maternal deprivation. So the sample, and again, this is a real life. The sample are real life, which is why we'll find out afterwards that the backgrounds are all very slightly different. So they used a sample of 44 teenage delinquents, and I do want to say that they were all accused of stealing. And that's where the title is quite interesting, because none of them were actually charged with theft. They were just accused of stealing. So what we don't know in this is whether they were actually criminals or not. The participants were interviewed. So these teenagers were interviewed for signs of what is called affectionless psychopathy. And the families were also interviewed to establish if there was any prolonged early separation from their mothers. And it was mothers in this case, because when the study was done, it was around the time before, I suppose, it was politically correct to start saying it's got to be a caregiver. Just to ensure that there was a comparison, he used a control group of 44 non-criminal teenagers. But he did also look at those children who had, the ones who particularly had emotional problems. And again, he wanted to have a look at the differences between the children who had experienced maternal deprivation against the children who had maternal deprivation and had stolen, but children who had also had maternal deprivation but hadn't stolen anything. So he wanted to find out where the patterns were, really, to find out what really is looking at what's the cause of criminals. And that's why we're going to bring this in when we look at forensics, because we're going to talk about potential causes of criminal behaviour. So he found, and these are the results that I'll discuss with you properly when I see you in class. He found that out of the 44 thieves, 14 were classed as being affectionless psychopaths. Now, I will talk to you when I've done gone through the study, about what we mean by an affectionless psychopath. And 17 of those 44 had maternal separation. Now, what I want to make clear on that is I've taken those directly from the book, but so we've got 17 out of 44 have maternal separation. Of those 17, 14 were identified as potentially being affectionless psychopath. Of those 14, 12 had experienced prolonged separation in the first 2 years of life. So really, in that group, what I want you to think about is that we're looking at two kind of aspects, really. We're looking at criminality, and we're also looking at the effects of maternal separation to see really if there's a link between the two. If you're separated from your mum early in this critical period, do you become a criminal or a thief or whatever in this case? The control group, only 2 out of the 44 had maternal separation, but none were categorised as affectionless psychopaths. Now, there are a couple of, well, there's quite a lot of issues with this study, and again, I will make sure I talk to you about it in person, because what you've got to do with this is, obviously, we've got to draw the conclusions that Bowlby's drawn for how they support his theory. But I want you to think yourself potentially about what the problems are with this. And the flip side of this is that if only 14 were affectionless psychopaths, there are more children who don't have those traits who also carried out criminal behaviour. So there is the flip side of this as well. But Bowlby concluded that prolonged separation and deprivation caused affectionless psychopathy. And he does bring in the word cause there, which is quite interesting, because the other thing that we've got an issue with this study is that we really can't find cause and effect, and that's because there are so many things happening in people's lives and in their upbringing. So when you're discussing this study, this is the study that supports the maternal deprivation hypothesis, and Bowlby has used to suggest that children who experience maternal separation or deprivation will become affectionless psychopaths and therefore become criminals. Right, okay. I want to just see if I can show you, before we go any further, if I can just find this for a second, what an affectionless psychopath is. And I just want to give you a clear definition. If I can just quickly, I'm saying quickly, it doesn't look very quick here doing this, but if I can just find this for you, and I'm aware that this is for next year, but I think you'll find it useful if we just have, I probably should have shown you this earlier on, what some of the ideas are behind affectionless psychopathy and where this comes from. So first of all, if we just talk about for a minute what a psychopath is, just a psychopath in general is someone who has some kind of antisocial personality disorder, and they are usually someone who doesn't show any empathy or remorse. But Bowlby created this term called affectionless psychopath. And can I just say, first of all, that just because somebody shows traits of psychopathy does not mean that they're going to become a serial killer or anything like that. There are a lot of people in very high-powered jobs who show signs of psychopathy, who don't go on to commit any criminal offences at all. It's kind of like a set of characteristics, if you like, or traits, and the way that you would respond to something. So you might have some of these traits yourselves. So Bowlby suggested that an affectionless psychopath is someone who has an inability to show affection or concern for others. And it's probably because they haven't had that affection early in life from the mum or from the main caregiver. And therefore they act on impulse with little regard for the consequences of their actions. And they don't really show any guilt for antisocial behaviour. And this is where, really, when we look at this in forensics, you would therefore bring in Bowlby and the 44 Thieves study. So make sure that you've got that study and that you're reasonably okay with it. You know what it shows. And if we just go on to just looking again at the study, sort of from a little bit of a different angle, what you can bring in here is was carried out in 1946. So what we can say is that it does have a lack of temporal validity. So it hasn't really stood the test of time, because I think views of criminality have kind of changed since then. And I suppose the word delinquent isn't something that we use, and there's quite an offensive term there, disturbed children. So if you want to use it in terms, I always prefer to do it the number out of 44, but I've just quickly put this slide in case you want to use it as a percentage. So 32% of delinquents had an affectionless character and inability to relate to others. 86% of these had experienced maternal deprivation. So Bowlby does really use this to support his theory of maternal deprivation and the importance of those early attachments to dictate your later life, really. So if we just have a look at this flowchart, you start off with some kind of disruption to the attachment process, and that at some point leads in an inability to form relationships with others. So when I said that there are intellectual, emotional and social effects, here we've got the social and emotional effects. We've got this inability to form normal relationships, and then the emotional effects, we've got a lack of restraint, moral constraint on behaviour. So people often, well, according to Bowlby, are not able to moderate themselves in terms of what's right and wrong, and therefore they engage in criminal behaviour. So that's what the maternal deprivation hypothesis is. In terms of criticism of data, one of the problems is that Bowlby got retrospective data. So what he did, he created his theory first, and this is something that we will look at next year, and what kind of theory this is and what the problems are with this. But he created his theory first and then got data to kind of fit it. So that's what retrospective is where you go back and you look on data and then you draw conclusions from it. So it's looking at data in the past, which is obviously a problem. But one of the main problems here is that with those children in the 44 Thieves study, that diagnosis of being affectionless was made by Bowlby himself. And therefore there is, and it's not just a possibility of bias, there is going to be bias there. If he's making a judgment on whether somebody has these traits or not. And again, something I mentioned was that we said that 12 of the 14 had experienced, of the 44, sorry, had experienced separation. Those periods of separation varied greatly, were different in duration, and the relationship with the mums were all different. So that makes it very difficult for us to draw conclusions because we're not comparing like with like. And Bowlby has been criticised for overemphasising the fact that there was a separation rather than the reasons for the separation, because I think the reasons for the separation are probably just as important as the fact that a separation existed. And obviously, we're assuming that nothing was put in place during that separation. And if you think about potentially you being separated from your parents at any point, it's very possible that other care took place, either grandparents or auntie, uncle, or whatever. But it's probably had this been some other care. So when Bowlby first published a formal statement about this, he published this in 1958, and at this point it was it was taken as being very, very significant because he was probably one of the first researchers to come up with this himself. Having experienced separation himself from his own mum, he was very passionate about this, and he wrote this paper in 1958, The Nature of the Child's Tie to His Mother. And this largely had a massive real life impact on maternity leave and on the rights of mothers, and the fact that the mothers should be with the child for the first 6 months, if not the first year. This PDD model here you don't need to know about anymore, but just in case you're interested, these are the three phases that children go through. How do we know that somebody is distressed by separation? So you actually don't know this, but you don't need to know this. This is what you do need to know. So from today, can you please ensure that you know what is meant by the term maternal deprivation and give an example? And again, I would potentially use the critical period. Outline evidence used to support the theory of maternal deprivation. That would be Bowlby and the 44 Thieves study. Explain one criticism of the theory of maternal deprivation. Well, I would probably use the idea that the term affectionless psychopathy was assessed and created by Bowlby himself, and therefore there is bias, if you like. But obviously there are lots of other criticisms that you could use there. If you have a look at your booklet, and in the Tutor to You pack, there are other criticisms that you could use. I will add some more material on this and some activities that you can do, but if there are any queries, please get in touch with me, and I will see you in school to discuss this further. Thank you.